Greetings once again, scholars, for our APUSH review for Unit 18 on George W. Bush and Barack Obama. And we'll go through the review sheet here from top to bottom. What was controversial about the 2000 presidential election and who are the candidates? Well, the Democratic candidate was Al Gore, the former vice president of Bill Clinton, and the Republican candidate was George W. Bush, the son of George H.W. Bush. And what's controversial is although Al Gore won 540,000 more actual real popular votes, the contest was over who won the state's winner-take-all electoral votes. And those electoral votes are all won by whoever has the most popular votes in the state of Florida. And that eventually came down to 537 votes more that Bush had. But the argument was over a recount, which was required by state law if the vote is within a 0.5%. And Bush challenged Gore, saying that Gore wanted to just selectively recount Democratic strongholds in some of the East Coast cities, and that this was unfair, and that Gore wanted to count the intent of what are called undercounts, where there was a blank next to a presidential name, where the ticket maybe had all these other Democratic votes, but there was no Democratic presidential vote punched out. And Bush said, on a technicality here, you don't count it if it wasn't marked. And Gore says, well, there's the intent we should count. And it also seemed to many Republicans that there was some mischief going on by counting and recounting the ballots until you found the votes you needed. They weren't really looking for inaccuracies. They were looking for a reason to count a vote. Gore, on the other hand, said that the Bush administration had illegitimately kept many people from voting by accusing them falsely of being felons, keeping out-of-state felons from voting, by confusing ballots such as the butterfly ballot, by not counting partially punched chads, which did show intent, by illegally counting late military ballots, and the Catherine Harris, who was the chairman of the Bush campaign in Florida, also happened to be the Secretary of State who's in charge of counting the votes and certifying that they were accurate. So the Gore campaign had a lot of complaints of their own here. And who ultimately decided this election was the U.S. Supreme Court in a 5-4 vote to stop the recount and give the election to Bush on the basis of Gore's asking for and using a non-uniform standard, basically just counting for counties where he was fishing for votes. Bush was accused of unilateralism. Define this and what are the examples of this. Unilateralism is the United States in foreign policy going our own way. It's the opposite of multilateralism. That's where you take into account the support, the needs, the thoughts of our allies in other countries. And Bush said that we would abrogate, we would violate the Kyoto Protocol, which Clinton had signed, saying that we would cut carbon emissions to fight global warming. Bush said we are going to take care of ourselves first, and where factories will stay open, we will not shut them down. The ABM, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which had been signed earlier by earlier presidents, where we wouldn't have anti-missile missiles. Bush said, no, we're going to protect ourselves. And his technicality here is it was signed with the USSR, which didn't exist anymore. Although the opponents of his action said, well, Russia, in all reality, is the inheritor of all these treaties. And the big thing here is Bush attacked Iraq under very questionable intelligence that Iraq had supported terrorism against the United States. Who attacked the U.S. on September 11, 2001? Al-Qaeda. That's A-L, separate word, and then Q-A-E-D-A, Al-Qaeda. You need to know Al-Qaeda. It's a terrorist group based out, led by a Saudi, Osama bin Laden, based out of Afghanistan. Where did they attack? Well, they attacked the World Trade Center, as in the Twin Towers. So 2 planes took out those 2 towers. There was another attack at the Pentagon where a plane crashed into the Pentagon building. And then there was a 4th plane which was supposed to head towards Washington, D.C., and it was it hit the ground in Pennsylvania, and all on board died. 15 of the 19 attackers were from Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is our purported ally. It is the #1 sponsor of very radical, very rigid Islam, and 15 of the 19 attackers are from Saudi Arabia. Why did the U.S. invade Afghanistan in 2001? Well, to topple the Taliban. That's the very fanatical Muslim government that was controlling Afghanistan, which had given safe haven to al-Qaeda and refused to turn al-Qaeda over to us. And we succeeded in toppling this government. And the other goal here was ultimately to capture Osama bin Laden, who was the mastermind of these attacks in the United States on 9/11. So the name of Afghanistan's oppressive government is the Taliban. And why was the U.S. invasion there a failure? Well, initially we drove the Taliban out. We put our own government in, democratic government. The problem here is the Taliban was never defeated. The Taliban grew back, became a very strong guerrilla group along the border in what's called the Pashtun areas, which is the largest of the ethnic groups. And Pakistan has played kind of a double game against us, claiming to be our ally, but giving the Taliban safe hideouts on their side of the border. And Afghanistan's government is also divided between very many ethnic groups and is sort of the definition of corruption, stealing from the public till and looking the other way to warlords growing opium and kind of running their own fiefdoms all over Afghanistan. Afghanistan also has an army which we spent over 10 years building, which cannot hold its own against the Taliban without U.S. support. So by every measurement here, the Afghan government is essentially non-democratic, non-functional. It's very corrupt. It does not have people willing to die for it like the Taliban are willing to die to get it out of power. What happened to Osama bin Laden? Well, Navy SEALs hunted him down and we killed him, hiding out in Pakistan, right next to their military academy where he had been given safe haven. Why is Pakistan so dangerous? Well, bigger picture here is Pakistan is the only Muslim country that has an atomic bomb and has a very precarious government hated by most of the people. Pakistan's government is corrupt. Many Pakistanis are fundamentalist Muslims who want something better than the right-wing dictatorship of Pakistan has provided. What was the official U.S. position for reason for invading Iraq in 2003? Looking for weapons of mass destruction. Those would be chemical weapons, biological weapons, and most importantly, we feared that Saddam Hussein was building atomic weapons, nuclear weapons. And this reason proved to be inaccurate after the invasion. We found none of these weapons, and we found no evidence of Hussein building any of them. How was the 2003 invasion under George Bush different from the invasion of his father, George H.W. Bush? Well, in 1991, the goal here was to evict Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, which he had invaded and occupied. That did happen, and it was successful. It was not an invasion to topple Saddam Hussein from power, which is what the 2003 invasion was. And we succeeded in knocking Hussein out of power. We hunted him down. He was tried. He was executed. And Iraq basically burst into anarchy and chaos and civil war. And it became just a disaster in our hands, which did not happen in 1991 Desert Storm. Who was Iraq's dictator? Saddam Hussein. His fate was he was executed by his own people. What was shock and awe? Shock and awe was the idea that we could go into Iraq with a very small, very swift, precision force, which we did, and we shocked and awed. We bombed, and we did this very fast, kinetic attack. Within 3 weeks, we were in Baghdad. We controlled the country, supposedly, quote unquote. Why did this fail in the long term in keeping the peace in Iraq? We did not have enough troops to control the country after we took it over. There was looting in Baghdad and other major cities. There was a crime wave. There was looting of weapons depots, which we could not stop. The borders were unsecured, and everybody wanted to kill an American. Al-Qaeda and other Muslim crazy groups crossed over, basically unrestricted from everywhere along the frontier. Why was the invasion of Iraq a disaster? Well, first of all, you had this what's called an asymmetrical warfare against the United States, which would be guerrilla warfare, where it made occupation just really a disaster for us. The goal was to make the American occupation intolerable, to show that we could not control the country. IEDs, improvised explosive devices, blew up American half-tracks and tanks and American foot soldiers, and terror attacks on anybody who cooperated with us, and sabotage against electrical pylons, knocking out power for the Iraqi cities, blowing up water treatment plants and oil producing facilities, and just basically bringing the economy to its knees. Know the differences between the Sunnis and the Shiites. Shiites are also called the Shia, and the Kurds. Well, 30% of Iraq are Sunnis, and the Sunnis were in power under Saddam Hussein, and they persecuted the other 70%. That 70% were 60% Shia and 10% Kurds. And today, with free elections under the Americans, the Shia have won power, and they're excluding the Sunnis. And the Sunnis resent this, and the Sunnis and the Shia, under American occupation, burst into a very violent and brutal civil war against each other, which we were virtually unable to restrain at all. Now keep in mind, neither the Shia or the Sunni liked the Kurds, and the Kurds had essentially made a self-governing enclave within Iraq. By all practical purposes here, they are an independent country. Why didn't Hussein allow UN weapons inspectors to search for weapons he did not possess? He never had them, so why didn't he let the UN come in? He agreed to let them come in 1991 when he ended the first war. Well, the big thing here is he wasn't afraid of us. We didn't topple him the first time. He was very afraid of the 70% of Iraqis who hated his guts. He wanted to spook them into thinking he had weapons. But the biggest fear was next door Iran. Remember, 1980 to 88, Iraq provoked a war with the Iranians, which caused 1 million casualties between both sides. This is a brutal war, largely forgot by many people at this stage in history, but the Iraqis are a smaller country, both in population and size, than the Iranians, and they were afraid of the Iranians. By the way, remember, Hussein was a Sunni and the Iranians are Shiites, and these two groups hate each other in kind of a medieval sort of way, where they prefer the other side to be dead or in positions of submission. Know the difference between the UN response to U.S. military action in 1991 Desert Storm and 2000, and should be 2003. It says 2001 on your review sheet. Should be 2003. 1991, we had UN support. The UN passed a resolution giving us permission to lead a multinational army to kick the Iraqis out of Kuwait. 2001, the UN did not give us this permission. The UN voted that this was an illegal war once it started. The Russians and the Chinese and the French all voted in the Security Council against us. Remember, any one of those countries has a veto to say no to any UN-sponsored military action. What was controversial about Guantanamo Bay and Abu Ghraib prisons? Well, prisoners held by Americans were tortured in these places. They were beaten, they were waterboarded, they were threatened, their families were threatened, they were sexually humiliated, they were thrown against walls, they were, what's the word, water hosed, put into extreme hot, extreme noisy, extreme cold cells, and many of them have been held for over a decade without charges, without any access to any sort of counsel, any sort of resolution to their fate. Why did Bush say the Geneva Convention does not apply to these prisoners who are in U.S. custody? Well, the Geneva Convention specifically says that if you're a soldier in uniform, you are to be treated well. And all of these people we have were not caught in military uniform. They are civilian insurgents, many of them from all sorts of different countries that we've picked up in Afghanistan and in Iraq. So on a technicality here, Bush said that they're not due any special treatment under the Geneva Convention. What's happened to Iraq's Christians? Well, they have fled. About 2/3 of them have fled Iraq. I think it's about 1.5 million. At the time of the invasion, about 500,000, probably less at this point. They've been threatened, they've been kidnapped, their churches have been blown up, they've been harassed, and the Christians have fled to adjacent countries, fled overseas. How has life in Iraq become worse after the U.S. invasion? Well, civil war, crime wave, looting, unreliable electricity, unreliable running water, unreliable health care. The healthcare system was a target of insurgents under American occupation, and the economy during the American occupation was crippled. Oil wells, oil refineries, oil pipelines were blown up by the insurgents. What was Bush's axis of evil? He's referring to three countries that he called to be, we needed to have a special concern for. One is Iraq. The accusation here was, of course, Saddam Hussein was building WMDs. The Iranians, who have and were and are, have been, and were building, trying to build nuclear weapons. And the great concern here is this fanatical regime would destroy Israel and perhaps threaten the United States. And the third country is in Asia, North Korea, and they've just done their fifth nuclear test, and they're building missiles to carry a payload to the United States. These are the three states that Bush said we needed to lean against. Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice are African-American secretaries of state, a male and a female back to back. How is Bush pro-life? Under him, you had a partial birth ban, partial birth abortion ban, and there were pro-life appointments to the Supreme Court. There was a ban on using fetal tissue from aborted fetuses for research, and he cut off abortion money for overseas family planning aid. No Child Left Behind. The heart of Bush's educational plan was to tie federal aid to the testing of children as they go through school, where you wouldn't get this aid unless you saw that they had adequately advanced to go on to the next academic rung. The new Social Security entitlement, which had great support among senior citizens, was an entitlement to prescription drugs, which wasn't in the original Medicare Act. So now there's a very, very crazy expensive entitlement that's been added under him, but with large support from the elderly community. Bush and taxes. Bush slashed taxes mostly to benefit the wealthy, and in turn the deficit exploded. Bush received a surplus from Bill Clinton, who had balanced the budget. The Patriot Act refers to government surveillance of all and any American's phones and electronic communications. Basically, the purpose here is to hunt down terrorists, and there has not been an attack like 9/11 since then, and some people attribute this to, we're doing surveillance, looking for messages from who Bush called the evil doers. Signing statements. Signing statements were ruled to be unconstitutional, and but Bush basically would receive a bill that was given to him to sign into law, and he would write a signing statement. He would state that he would not obey part of that bill, and then he would sign it into law. And this is essentially what's called a line item veto, and this was given to the president in 1998, and the U.S. Supreme Court struck this down. You cannot give the President of the United States, under the way the United States Constitution is written, a line item veto. You cannot selectively say which parts of a law you do not like and are going to basically cross out, thus the term line item veto. And a signing statement is just another way of doing this, and Bush did it anyhow. Hurricane Katrina, 2005, 1,245 American dead, mostly African Americans in New Orleans. And Bush was considered to be very dilatory, very slow and dithering in his response to this disaster. A lot of fallout there, especially in the Black community. 2008 banking collapse. This is the second largest economic collapse in American history, basically caused to a certain degree by very big banks making very risky loans at great profit, and these loans just basically imploded. They caved in when the economy fell, and the chief executive officers of these banks voted themselves, their boards voted them billions of dollars in bonuses in spite of these banks collapsing, and there's never been any punishment of a single one of these CEOs. Many of them, we have all the documentation for fraud, for violation of federal law. There's been no regulations under Bush passed to keep this from happening again, and Bush's response has not just been hands-off, but has been to give these banks close to $1 trillion in taxpayer money to bail them out. John Roberts and Samuel Alito are two conservative, Republican-leaning Supreme Court justices that Bush appointed. Jumping down to Barack Obama, his ethnic background, he had a Kenyan father. Barack Obama is our first mixed race, first black president of the United States. Nobel Peace Prize win. No, Obama will win the Nobel Peace Prize in his first term for not doing anything specific at all. He will be given the prize for encouraging peace and by promising to act with other countries and not to act alone. It's a specific slap against President Bush's unilateralism, doing things like invading Iraq and starting a war without listening to the concerns of other countries who didn't think that we had either the right or the evidence. Obama's most controversial law is Obamacare. This is the health care for basically all. And the pros of this are the government subsidizes the poor. Many more poor people have access to health care. You can't drop somebody because they are sick. In fact, you can't deny somebody medical care for pre-existing conditions. And this used to be standard for people getting new insurance. You can't have a lifetime limit. So people who've got perhaps very long cancer treatment aren't going to be bumped off because they've hit their max. Young people can stay in their parents' health care plans till age 26. And there's a rule that healthcare companies have to spend, or insurance companies have to spend 80% of the money they take in on healthcare. They can't basically vote the executive directors, oodles of money that have nothing to do with healthcare. So these are things which probably most people will say, to a certain extent, are good things. The bad things are, the big one is, this is essentially a tax. All Americans now legally have to have health care insurance, and you will be fined if you're not paying for health care insurance. So to make all these benefits, these no pre-existing conditions possible, there has to be a broader pool of healthy people. So the Supreme Court has ruled that you can be forced to buy health insurance. Of course, Obama will say he will make it affordable if you're a lower income earner. Also, a very big concern for the religious community is forced contraception coverage. Some contraceptives are abortifacients. They cause a fertilized egg not to implant into the uterus. And this has, essentially, it's an abortion. And many Catholic groups don't support any type of contraception. So there's been a concern here. Obama has been very adamant, and his administration has been very strictly enforcing this on all religious groups, in particular Catholics. And some of this is still up in the air. As far as homosexual advances under Obama, Obama stopped enforcing the Defense of Marriage Act, which federal law under Clinton said the U.S. government would only acknowledge marriage between a man and a woman. So Obama stopped enforcing that. What this means is all federal benefits for married couples, if you were a federal employer or getting any sort of federal benefits, this counted if you had a homosexual partner. He also okayed homosexuals to openly not just be in the military, but to be, to be married on military bases and things like that. But the big kicker here, which Obama didn't have anything specific to do with, other than he did appoint a number of Supreme Court justices who voted yes for this. The Supreme Court voted to uphold homosexual marriage as being the equivalent of heterosexual marriage in the United States. Backside of the review sheet here, Deepwater Horizon 2010. British Petroleum had a massive blowout in the Gulf of Mexico, causing millions of gallons of petroleum to pollute the beaches of what would be Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida before it was capped. And BP, of course, was sued and fined and paid all sorts of reparations. But this is the biggest environmental disaster on Obama's watch. Not that he caused it, but something that happened during his time in office. Obama's promise concerning Afghanistan and Iraq, he promised to pull American forces out, and he did. He pulled out the vast majority of our troops. There's a residual force of trainers and people guarding our embassies, but essentially we are out of these two countries. And some people argue that he was voted into office based after 8 years of frustration under Bush's disastrous invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq. Americans just were fed up, tired, exhausted, and wanted out. 2009 GM and Chrysler bankruptcies. Well, when the real estate market crashed and the banks were, floundering, GM and Chrysler ran out of money, and Obama bailed them out. There were billions of dollars that went into these two corporations to keep them going. Argument is we can't lose the American car industry. We can't have tens of thousands of American workers unemployed, and the car factories buy supplies from many supplier factories are tied into the American auto industry. Syria's problem: Syria under Obama burst into a brutal civil war against a brutal dictator named Bashar Assad, and Obama's response has been to threaten but to do nothing. Again, it's part of that policy of staying out of Middle Eastern affairs. We just got out of Iraq. We just got out of Afghanistan. Problem here in Syria is millions of refugees have fled to all around the Middle East. They fled to Europe. There's about 1 million people in 2015 who have been allowed into Germany alone. Just astounding numbers. The Russians have been drawn into Syria. They have a naval base in Syria, and they have been backing the Assad regime. Assad has basically pounded and killed civilian neighborhoods, and he has used poison gas. And in this sort of a political vacuum of chaos in Syria, ISIS has emerged, also in the chaos in northern Iraq. So ISIS, the Islamic State in Syria, also called the Islamic State in the Levant. Levant is the Mediterranean. ISIL is the name that Barack Obama calls ISIS, is in that area of kind of lack of government in northern Iraq and in eastern Syria. ISIS is this fanatical Muslim group, and they're Sunnis. These are the people that got displaced by the eviction of the Ba'ath Party, which was led by Saddam Hussein. When the Sunnis got kicked out, you know, the ISIS here, it's not just a bunch of people who just all of a sudden sort of happen to have guns and vehicles. These are arguably the leaders of what used to be the Iraqi army, and they're in the Sunni zone of Iraq, and they are there because of the ill treatment that the new Shia government has done towards them. I mean, they've been hunted down, they've been arrested, they've been denied power, election results have been ignored. I mean, there's a religious war, an ethnic war between Sunnis and Shia, basically going on in the Middle East, and ISIS is killing Shiites. ISIS is killing any Sunnis that are disloyal, and ISIS is brutally killing Yazidis, which is a religious group that is in northern Iraq, and ISIS is killing Christians. Vladimir Putin, 2014, he is the president of Russia. He's invaded the Ukraine and taken the Crimean Peninsula, held a vote there, and the Crimean vote says that Crimea wants to be part of Russia. Putin has also provoked a civil war in eastern Russian-speaking Ukraine, which is kind of a low-intensity, simmering civil war that's still going on. And there's non-uniformed Russian troops that are giving aid and support to the Ukrainian rebels. And this is to bring instability against the Ukrainian government. Remember, Russia has claimed the Ukraine ever since Peter the Great and Ivan the Terrible and Catherine the Great and the communists. I mean, there's kind of this feeling that Ukraine never really should have been allowed to be independent. Controversy in the South China Sea. There are some islands called the Spratly Islands, and the South China Sea is bordered by these countries which all claim these islands. And that would be the little principality of Brunei, Taiwan, China, Malaysia, and the Philippines. And what is concerning to the United States is our policy is we're not taking any side officially. We are demanding free passage of ships through the South China Sea, which there has always been. We're not taking anybody's side as to who owns, but we're saying that there should be no military occupation and building up of any armaments on any of these islands. And China has taken some of these islands, has built military bases, has built fighter jet capability airstrips, and the concern here is, you know, what sort of military tensions this is leading up to. And this is something which Obama has been repositioning our military towards the Pacific to meet any future, you know, incidents there, which we're trying desperately to not to happen. Elena and Sonia Sotomayor, these are two very liberal, left-leaning Supreme Court justices that Obama has put on the Supreme Court. And Sonia Sotomayor is interesting in that she is the first Hispanic, and she is a Puerto Rican gal from New York City. So there you have it. There's our review for the test on on Unit 18, and this is the younger Bush, Bush number 43, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama. Signing out. Keep calm and carry on.